So as Helene mentioned, I'm Cort Anastasio. I'm a professor in the Department of Land, Air, and Water Resources, and I'm going to be the moderator for the first panel, which is on air. And we're going to start with a lightning talk from Professor Ermias Kebreab, who is in the Department of Animal Science.
Okay, so let's start. I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to have to go very fast. Let's see. Right. Okay, so today I'm going to be, let me see if I can go back. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about methane emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, focusing on cattle. And so why are we worried about? What's the challenge? So the methane challenge right now is methane is continuing to increase in the concentration in the atmosphere, and it is about 86 times or to 20 times, so to 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide, depending on the time frame that you look at. But it only survives in the atmosphere for about 12 years. So if you can start doing something about it, then you can get a slowdown in the increase in temperature. So what we've seen so far, or what's been estimated, is that about half a degree of increase in temperature since the Industrial Revolution is because of methane. So if we are able to reduce methane by about 30% by 2040, we can save about 0.3 degrees centigrade warming, or by 2100 would be about 0.5 degrees centigrade warming could be saved by reducing methane emissions. So what are we doing about it? Methane emissions, particularly anthropogenic methane emissions, about a third of it comes from agriculture, particularly from ruminants. We have a third from oil and gas and coal and other things, although some of the estimates in oil and gas is about 5 times less than it actually is. But anyway, that's a discussion for another day. Cattle still have a major impact on the environment in terms of methane emissions. And so we did this analysis looking at if we implement a lot of this sort of good practices, would we be able to stay within 1.5 degrees centigrade? And what we found out is that by 2030 we can, but not by 2050. So we need to have more innovations to be able to reduce these emissions even further. So this is some of the solutions that exist right now that may have an implication in terms of the efficacy. So these are all kind of feed additives that can be added to the feed of the animals in a very small quantities and have a large reduction in emissions. So I'm going to talk about one specific one in particular, and that is the seaweed, the microalgae, Asparagopsis taxiformis. So you see, Davis, here, we were the first one to do a in vivo trial using microalgae in dairy cattle. That was in 2018, and what we found was about 67% reduction in emissions. So that was quite big. The biggest one was about 30%. So 67% was huge, but then what we found out is that there is a problem in terms of palatability. The cows did not really like it. They don't like the salty kind of taste of seaweed. So we got another type of seaweed with a greater concentration of the active ingredient, which is the bromoform. And when we did that work with beef cattle, what we saw was we could actually reduce emissions by about 80%. So 80% reduction in emissions from beef cattle. But feed additives, you have to give them on a daily basis. And a lot of the emissions come from cows that are on pasture. And so what we tried to do was we set up this trial in Montana, one of the biggest ranches in the country, where we supplement them with this pelletized form of seaweed. And what we found was that you could reduce it by about 40%, but it depends how much they eat it. We still have a little bit of an issue in terms of palatability, but that's been solved right now. There's a lot of work that's been happening to try to solve that palatability issue, making it more into the oil form or in a pelletized form, but adding different colorings and taste so that the animals can consume it. Now, some of you might think like, well, if you know the active ingredient, why bother growing seaweed and processing and all that? Why can't you just use that active bromoform? Well, a couple of companies have done that. And we've worked with one of them called Ruminate. And basically, you have a bromoform that's stabilized, and we use the powder form and the oil form. And this research, we just finished it back in December. And what we found was that For the oil form, we actually can reduce it by about 90%. The emissions were reduced by 90%. In some cows, the emissions were actually below the detection limit of the equipment that we were using. So pretty impressive stuff, but the issue is that bromoform at a higher concentration is considered to be a carcinogen. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and it's been done. This kind of work has been replicated around the world. CDFA actually has put in $10 million very recently. A lot of that funding will be coming to UC Davis. And finally, this is something that I'm really excited about, which is using microbial engineering. So methane emissions is because of the microbes. So now we're going directly into the source. This is a $70 million, 7-year project in collaboration with UC Berkeley and UCSF. And we're using 2 core technologies. We're using CRISPR to basically, first of all, identify the genes, and then use CRISPR to edit the genes so that we can stop methanogenesis and make it into the whole microbiome. So there's the methanogenomics part of it, there's the CRISPR part of it. You put it together so we can get the edited microbes throughout the whole rumen. And the hope is by the next 5 to 7 years, we will have a microbiome that does not produce methane. So this research just begun, about 6 months into it right now, and we're going to be starting the animal work, I think next week or the week after, as soon as we get the IACUC approval. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ermias. Our next speaker will be Professor Yufang Jin from the Department of Land, Air, and Water Resources.
All right, good morning, everyone. So next, I'm going to talk about wildfires, which is one of the biggest sources for greenhouse gas emissions and also toxic air pollutants. So I believe everyone in this room has experienced the impact of worsened air quality due to the wildfires, especially in the last 5 to 7 years. So right now, the studies have found that almost 25% of the fine particles actually came from wildfires, up from 10% in the past decade. In California, because of this mega fires, the magnitude of those fires actually contributing to almost 50% of fine particles. As you can see, during extreme wildfires, the whole sky can be blocked by these pollutants. And these wildfires destroyed lots of trees in our forest ecosystems and lots of houses in our communities, and again, threatening the health of our people in our communities. So how do we get here, and what we can do to reduce these mega fires and also the associated air pollutions? To answer these questions, we need to look at wildfires really at intersections of climate change, vegetative fuels, and also human activities. Because wildfire is really a very complicated process. In our research, we took a big data machine learning approach, trying to piece together all these different components in the full life cycle. We try to learn from historical wildfires to figure out what are the main factors driving these mega fires and how we can predict into the future. So. I'll just go over very quickly some of the projects that we have been doing, looking at wildfire drivers and vulnerabilities. So first, how did wildfires started? In California, the majority of wildfires are actually caused by humans. Our study found that within wildland, urban interface, and nearby areas, actually, almost 80% of ignition came from those areas, especially along the road corridors. So these findings actually support the roadside fuel management and also the fire-resistant landscape design. So there's a big role in terms of ignition management to reduce future wildfire risk. And Also looking at the fuel management perspective, if you look at wildfires from different causes, for wind-driven fires, what we found is they typically occur at different areas from typical summer fires. And those fires are fast spreading and cause lots of damages for communities. The historical data shows that the fuel management in this wind-driven fires actually is less effective in stopping the wildfire spread. The implication for fuel management is we really need to look at different strategies for different fire regimes, and one-size-fits-all fire management strategy most likely won't be effective. And one of the central components for wildfire impacts is really the severity of those wildfires. So we have looked at historical data by incorporating the satellite-based fuel monitoring database and the observed fire behavior also from satellite. And the machine learning model shows that the drought combined with heat waves actually contributing to this exacerbated fire severity in North Coast regions. And the model can also predict the fire severity by incorporating all those near real-time monitoring of fuels and weather information. So this predicted burn severity can help us to better prepare for firefighting and community preparedness. Fuels is a critical component for wildfire cycle, and fuels are also the component we can manage as a society at different scales. So we are trying to improve the monitoring capability of severity of burns, trying to use remote sensing data from very high spatial resolution so we can actually figure out the survival or mortality at individual canopy scales. So this big data can help us also understand how pre-fire fuel structure conditions affect the severity of fires. Right now, we are focusing on the wildland-urban interface. That's where the community is facing increasing risk of wildfire and exposure to air quality. Again, both the monitoring and linkage of the community development and weather on fire behavior will help us to design better strategies to reduce community vulnerability to future wildfires. All right, thank you.
Good morning, panel. Just a note that you probably see in front of you, to have the microphone work, you got to press the button. So we're going to start with self-introductions. I'll go first. So as I mentioned, Cort Anastasio from the Department of Land, Air, and Water Resources. And I study the chemistry of the atmosphere, air pollution, and I teach about those subjects as well as climate change. Sahota?
I'm Chodapo U. I'm a professor of atmospheric science and a biometeorologist in the AES that Dean Dillard was just explaining about. My project really is to look at things like evapotranspiration, that's water loss to the atmosphere from plants, including wildlands and agriculture, methane emissions, and then carbon dioxide sinking sequestration into plants, but also release that can happen with some of the older ecosystems. So those are all in my research portfolio. We do theory, we do models, we do experiments to measure and find new ways to measure that are cheaper and more practical. And then we interface with remote sensing that Yufang does a lot of also, and many people in this campus do. So we also do deal with that. We have projects from CAL FIRE, ARB, the Department of Water Resources. So it's a gamut, because anytime you release water vapor, you're also trying to get carbon dioxide in for plant ecosystems. So there's this linkage that's intertwined. I have some little toys here to show some of the instruments we use. Some of you in the back might not be able to see too well. These are sonic anemometers. We're measuring about 200,000 times an hour for measurements like this, the different types that we use. Thanks.
My name is Zhang. I am a professor in the Department of Environmental Toxicology, and my research centers around understanding the atmospheric particulate pollutants. And that was motivated by the fact that these pollutants has major important adverse effects on human health, on climate, and also affecting the air quality. And my research primarily involve performing field studies, doing the observation and the measurements of particulate pollutants composition and concentration, and also perform targeted lab-based experiments trying to understand the certain aspect of the pollution emission and the transformation, and also develop new instrumentation or optimize instrumentation for better understanding the sources, the emission sources, the chemical transformations, and also the processes of atmospheric pollutants.
Good morning. I'm Rajinder Sahota, the Deputy Executive Officer for Climate Change and Research at the California Air Resources Board. I want to thank Dean Dillard for the invitation to join you all here today. I am an Aggie. I graduated from here in 2001, so it's always good to come back and speak with everybody else that's coming up through the ranks here. My agency is over 50 years old, and it traditionally looked at air pollution. So how do you meet the federal and state air quality standards for ozone, particulate matter, and other criteria pollutants? And it was in 2006 that our legislature, which reviewed and acted on the latest science on climate change, where AB 32 was passed. And so what you've seen since 2006 is science underpinning dozens of rules and regulations and statutes at the state level because our elected officials believe in that science and act on that science. And once those things are put into statute, it is agencies like mine, ARB, which then do rules and regulations to actually address those emission sources and make sure that we're achieving the targets that are set in statute. You heard about methane in one of the lightning talks. Well, SB 1383 was passed in 2013, and then in 2014, we developed a plan for how to reduce emissions from cows, oil and gas, and other short-lived climate pollutants that are in the atmosphere, such as refrigerants. There was also AB 1279 that was passed in 2022, which looked at carbon neutrality by 2045. And what carbon neutrality really did was say the focus shouldn't just be on industrial sources and fossil fuel combustion sources, but we really need to look at our natural and working lands. And so what can we do when it comes to our agricultural lands, our forests, our wetlands, our coastal lines, in terms of reducing emissions that are subject to wildfire and pesticide, but also how do we make those landscapes a sink? How do we manage them in a sustainable manner? So it's not just about maximizing the carbon sequestration, it's about managing our natural working lands in a more sustainable manner to make sure that they can be active in terms of turning into sinks over the long term, but also making sure that they're not part of the issues that we see when it comes to those catastrophic wildfires that we heard about, and the particulate matter and the greenhouse gases that are released there. So again, I just want to underscore that it's the science that underpins our statutes, it's the science that underpins our rules and regulations, and that's why the work that happens at universities such as Davis are so important to the work that we do.
Wow, what incredible speakers. I've already learned so much, and it's 9:50. I'm Clare Cannon. I'm Associate Professor in the Department of Human Ecology. My research and teaching is broadly on environmental justice and climate adaptation, and I focus on policy-relevant, community-engaged research partnering with communities across California.
All right, thank you. Also, to start off our discussion, a question for each of the UC Davis panelists to begin. Talk about what you see as a big air challenge for California and how specifically your agricultural experiment station project or projects addresses that. And let's start with Clare this time, and we'll come towards me.
I wasn't anticipating that, Cort.
Surprise.
It's a great question. So my AES project is partnering with communities across California. We have co-PIs at UC Irvine and UC San Diego, and we're taking a novel instrument developed here by Dr. Tony Wexler called the TARTA instrument. And what that does is it measures metallic compounds in the atmosphere in real time. So maybe many of us have heard of PM 2.5, right? We know it's bad for people. It's been linked to a number of adverse health outcomes. And what metallic compounds, they make up the PM 2.5. And I'm sure other panelists can speak more about that as well. But what we're doing is we're taking this novel technology and we're putting it in the hands of communities on frontline and fence line communities with poor air quality. And so I'm working with United Latinos in Sacramento. I'm working with Rise South City in San Bruno. We just deployed our first instrument a couple weeks ago. I took a bunch of grad students down and working with the communities to get the information in their hands so that they can advocate with regulators at different levels to remediate and reduce the environmental injustice that they experience.
Okay, so again, come back to my focus on the AS project is looking at the particulate pollutants particularly in the Central Valley of California, and that was I think that was really I can use that as an example about talking about the challenges with these air quality problems. It's air quality. The air pollutants are a multifaceted issue. To understand how much are there in the air. Where do they come from and how they transform, and the properties that eventually related to human health or related to affecting the climate, etc. is not a simple. It's not a simple question to answer, and that's one of the to address that. It really involves measurements to do the measurements to understand the trends and to using the measurement to understand the processes, and then also provide the information with to the policymakers so that the information can be incorporated in the developing or evaluation of the new policy, and also the in terms of I'm just taking another example, which is this wildfire emissions. And for the Central Valley of California, especially agriculture related area, you have local emissions, you have regional emissions, and then you have wildfire. When you have this mixed soup of pollutants, you could end up with the pollution that has the very different characteristics than the typical emissions that in absence of wildfire emissions. So those are, again, these are coming into the scientific questions, trying to understand those processes, and as a result, to better manage the or control the local emission, the agriculture area air quality problems.
So as I mentioned, evapotranspiration is a big issue that happens for water loss, right? Where you lose water from plants. We wouldn't have the plants that we have here. In the old days with the Putnam people, for example, here, we didn't have the same sort of plant systems, so we didn't have the same water loss that we have now with all the irrigation that we use. So how do we manage the water? And what does that affect in terms of air quality? You'll see a poster, if you have time, that Suha Chen and my team worked with that shows that the boundary layer height, which is what allows the mixing of pollutants in the atmosphere, is lower when you have irrigation. It could be lower. And if it's lower, it means there could be more pollution at the ground level. So it's an interesting interaction that happens. We have to eat. We have to irrigate if we're growing stuff in the Central Valley. But there's this unintended consequence that naturally could be happening. And that's from a set of modeling in addition to measurements that are connected together. So that's the type of work I do for the AES, is this connection of carbon fluxes, water vapor, methane. We look at all those things. We look at modeling. We look at experiments where we have to use devices like this thing here. And we look at how to analyze those data. It's very challenging. I have a little number here that about 200,000 measurements from an instrument like this per hour that we have to look at. And then we have to compare it with what regulators and the federal and state governments can use, which are things like satellites to look at wider areas. You can imagine each one of these is around $10,000, and then you put other equipment with it. It's about $30,000, $40,000 per instrument that's measuring maybe about 100 meters around you. For remote sensing, of course, you can look at the whole state, but its ability to see is only seeing electromagnetic stuff, and everyone blink. That was the satellite that passed over just about an hour, about 2 hours, and then 8 days later, the next one passes over, blink. That's the measurement it takes in this area. So you can imagine that has to be filled in. That type of remote sensing, which is absolutely necessary for a large state and for a nation and globally, has to be filled in with ground truth measurements that we take, and then using models to be able to extrapolate and interpolate between them. So that's the type of work that I do with my AES stuff.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to turn now to Rajinder. So Rajinder, you've been at the Air Resources Board for roughly 20 years, right? And I'm wondering from your perspective, from ARB's perspective, what do you see as the major air challenges facing the state?
So that's a great question, and it's one that we get quite often. I talked about how it was just in 2006 that we started working on reducing greenhouse gases. And what's emerging now is a climate penalty. What that means is with warming temperatures, those warming temperatures could almost wipe out 50 years of progress that we have made on criteria pollutants and harmful local air pollution to achieve those federal and state standards. And so one of the challenges for us is trying to understand what additional sources are out there for those pollutants. How do we measure and monitor those and make sure that any efforts that we're doing on the larger sources that are well known, like tailpipe emissions from vehicles, from combustion of fossil fuels, so other sources of those same criteria pollutants are well known and understood, so we can figure out how to properly control and limit those emissions, because we're going to have to work even harder under a warming temperature to make sure that we're meeting those federal and state air pollution standards. And that means that it's innovative tools for monitoring and measurement. It's understanding sources that we've never thought of as important sources or large sources in the historical context. And so with the evolving climate change that we're seeing, the impacts that we're seeing, we're going to have to figure out what additional areas we need to control to make sure that that climate penalty doesn't wipe out all the progress that we've made to date on harmful local air pollution.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if people realize how much progress the state has made since the 1970s. If you go back and look at what the LA basin looked like in the 70s in terms of air pollution, it was horrific, right? You had levels of ozone and particulate matter that we don't see anymore in this state except during wildfires. So really the work that the ARB has done in conjunction with, agricultural experiment station projects and other researchers from across the state have made a huge difference. And so climate change now is challenging some of those advances that we've made and some of the progress that we've made, and that's definitely a big challenge. I also want to point out, some of what Clare was talking about. One of the reasons we care about air in California is because it kills us. These small particles floating around in the air are one of the worst environmental hazards that exist. They kill roughly 4 million people a year globally. So it's a big deal. It's an enormous source of human mortality, and trying to reduce those pollutants is, again, something that people on AES projects are working towards. I want to turn now and try to get a discussion going, because we're trying to discuss things. So I know it's a little hard with this kind of layout of the table, but I want to talk about how we as researchers try to inform policy, how we try to make a difference. And then, Rajinder, I'd love to get your perspective as a regulator in terms of, how can scientists maybe make that more effective? So let's try to talk to each other, see if this will work, and anybody can start.
Maybe I can start. So, Clare, the work that you're doing in the community monitoring and trying to understand what's actually happening at that very localized level, that is critical because the current monitoring network in the state of California is about meeting federal standards and state standards. And what it often overlooks is some of those more localized impacts where you're right next to a fence line for those sources. And while we can do monitoring networks and all of those pieces that are important, even satellite data, what we miss is what somebody might be exposed to the minute they open a window or open their front door. And so looking at tools and ways to monitor and measure and empower community science, the work that you're doing is evolving and becoming even more critical for state regulators. Because ultimately what we want to do is not just think about controlling individual sources, which is still important, but actually reducing the exposure to a person in the community in which they live. And so you could have a myriad of rules and regulations, but what really matters is what's in the air that you breathe as an individual. And so, having worked with Chada, I actually was one of his summer employees when I was a grad student. So I remember those instruments, and I remember being out in the cornfield plots when we were monitoring for evaporative losses. All of those pieces, when we think about natural and working lands, are critical as well because we think about how those landscapes can be a part of the solution, how they might be contributing using just existing methods to maximize crop yield, but can we do less with pesticides? Can we do less with some of the watering techniques and still get the same yield? And so a lot of the work that you're doing on the nature-based side and agricultural side is going to feed in directly into the work that Secretary Ross oversees and Secretary Crowfoot oversee as part of natural resources. And so we are, as ARB, get to plug into all of the sectors of the economy because all of the sectors of the economy are either sources or sinks or both in terms of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And I'd be interested to know, because satellite data is something that comes up, I'd be interested to know how do you message and how do you talk about the need for both the very personalized monitoring and some of the community science that's emerging and some of the larger data collection efforts that are out there, and how do you all see those?
All right, so this is a difficult question that you're mentioning. Like Tony Wexler's device that he developed can be easily placed in different locations for community science, for example. We've also developed something for community science among growers, which is something called surface renewal. It's something that actually is about this size, but does something much faster and quicker. It's been commercialized. We have a patent on it. There's a company named Thule. I'm not sure I'm allowed to mention that. I don't have shares in Thule, but it was one of our former grad students that formulated this startup. So not only do we have interactions with government agencies, but there's startups that come out of our systems, and Ermias was mentioning a sort of startup company also, or a company that was involved in this types of stuff that we do here. So the research doesn't just go into the federal and state agencies and government agencies, it goes into sometimes commercial activities too. Making things small means every grower could have one of these devices in there. I think right now it costs something like around $2,000. It started out around $1,000, but I think there's been inflation for my colleague's company that he's been doing. So that's an example. It's like a subscription. They have to go through a business model. You subscribe to this, and you get the amount of water loss that happens. There are other companies that do something similar. There's another competing company that does something similar. So that's an example of formulating devices based on the science and the theory. And that came out completely out of theoretical stuff. Again, unexpected. We were doing theoretical studies of turbulence. How does the air move around? And then we realized when it's moving around carbon dioxide and the water vapor and temperature. And we figured out by looking at the temperature, we could then make an extrapolation to what's happening with water. So that's how we did this device, and just uses a thermocouple. It's a small device that's about this size that can measure temperature. You do have to measure it very fast again. We have to measure it thousands of times a second. An hour, so 10 times a second. That's an example of how we go all the way from theory to applications that can go down to the grower level. We also had a farm worker experiment for community science where we tried to put temperature and humidity devices in farm workers' residences, temporary residences they're in, to see how much heat stress they might have. Many of the times these things are not air conditioned. These residences aren't air conditioned in any way. So we wanted to see what extremes were happening. We had to go through the concepts of these devices that were small enough. We bought commercial devices, but they were small enough, not openable enough that things like the batteries might be swallowed by the children. So we had to go through safety, the Institutional Review Board, the IRB, safety, to make sure we could do this experiment as trying to figure out what's going on there. So there's a lot of this community issues that interface with the type of stuff we do. And it goes all the way from things like large-scale water loss to small-scale, okay, are people being exposed to heat stress in addition to the particulates and other things that then can cause a lot of sickness or morbidity and sometimes even fatalities, what we're saying.
Gee, I know you've done a lot of work in Fresno in the San Joaquin Valley. Can you talk about how your work maybe influences or informs policy, and have you had any experiences with that intersection?
Sure. Yeah, well, I just want to add on, like Chalda and Clare, they are mentioning the measurements, highlight the importance of doing measurements and then doing fast real-time measurements. But the instrument they mentioned primarily are called sensors, or relatively low cost. Even it's already at tens of thousands of dollars. But there are in order to answer this complex questions about atmospheric particulate pollutants, we actually need even more sophisticated and advanced instrumentation, and that's what my lab been focusing on. And that was just because the particles that we're breathing just in this room, every breath you take is probably tens of thousands of particles you're breathing in. And the size of them vary from less than 10, about a few tens of nanometers up to maybe a few micrometer. And our hair diameter is about 50 micrometers. So it's really small particles we're breathing. And those ones are very, very complex. If you take individual one, their compositions can be hugely different, and their size and their composition all affect eventually influence their effects on the human health or climate or air quality. So understanding these chemical physical properties of the particles is very important to answer that questions about how this various effects of this type of air pollutants. And also another really important aspect is to understand where do they come from, right? And in a quantitative way, so that that information is important for identify the bad players, and also to check for the policy. The effectiveness of the policy, because there's various initiatives coming to reduce the vehicle emission, reduce say the biomass burning curtailment, or there's plans of have planned burning to reduce wildfire. So the question is, how effective are those policies are, and you need measurement data. And you need actually not just the measurement of the total amount of particles and how their concentration change. You also need to know the sources of them in a quantitative way, and that's what we do. We have currently this is as a part of this AES project. We have long-term measurements. We have 2 mass spectrometers. Deployed in the San Joaquin Valley. One is Fresno, the other is in Bakersfield. That was doing the real-time measurements, providing chemical composition data on the 10-minute time scale. and then and it's continuous measurement. So we have had that for more than a year now. And in addition to that, because that mass spectrometer is still kind of relatively limited chemical information provided. So on top of that, we also do intensive field campaigns, bring over much more sophisticated high-resolution mass spectrometers for real-time measurement of black carbon, sulfate, nitrate, ammonium, chloride, various organics, and then both on the molecular level and also on the bulk composition level. And then we pull that information in and perform this statistical modeling, try to understand the sources and provide and also the trends, and provide that information to the modelers, help to improve the modeling, and also checking for one aspect is to checking for the effectiveness of the policy for air quality management.
Thank you. I want to change topics now. I think one of the most exciting developments in air pollution, as well as other environmental pollutants, has been the topic of environmental justice. And Clare, I wonder if you could start by just giving us a definition of environmental justice and maybe giving us some examples of environmental injustice, specifically for air.
Yeah, it's a great question. I would describe environmental justice as kind of the inequality that we experience environmentally, right? So we can think about social inequality. We can think about that in terms of access or lack of access to resources. We can think about that in a variety of different ways. And environmental justice, similarly, right, we borrow from that concept, is the ways that we experience inequality or lack of access or burdens or harms from the environment. So example might help explain that further. With respect to air quality, that could be living really close to traffic, like say 80 or I-5 or 380 or 280 or 101, right? And all those emissions, all those particulates folks are talking about coming off of the cars, right? And breathing that air. We can think about that being close to agricultural fields. And with dust that maybe come off or pesticides that may come off, right, and impact communities in a variety of different ways. And so poor air quality, right, I'm talking about sources that could contribute to poor air quality, we know has been linked to adverse health outcomes like asthma, like valley fever. It also relates to toxic stress, so we know people can feel stressed. That's associated with living near these environmental hazards that produce this poor air quality. And so those would be instances of environmental injustice. And so one of the things that we do is we partner with communities that might be experiencing a high burden of environmental injustice. I always have my students look at CalEnviroScreen. It's this great tool that the state puts out, and you can look at different forms of environmental inequality coupled with social vulnerability across the state at the census tract level. If you haven't checked it out, it's worth looking at. And so one of the things that we do is we partner with communities that are these frontline, fence-line communities that are experiencing high environmental injustice. We know environmental injustice tends to be co-located. So if you are experiencing one form of, say, poor air quality, maybe you're also experiencing lack of access to clean water, right? Or maybe you're experiencing multiple sources that are contributing to poor air quality. So we work with communities to measure, to monitor, to increase both their kind of capacity for science, but also their advocacy capacity. So their ability to kind of speak for themselves and to really work with regulators and policymakers to improve their environmental circumstances. We also partner with regulators. So on our AES project, we're partnering both with community residents, community partners, so local community-based organizations in the communities we're working with, but we also partner with the air quality management districts. So we're partnering with the policy and regulators because, you know, as you hear, they want to know, right? They want to know what is the exposure, how can we identify sources using this hyper-local, real-time, cost-effective monitors. so that we can reduce the impacts. We can reduce the environmental injustice through a variety of means, both in terms of community engagement, advocacy, and policy.
Yeah, thank you. Rajinder, can you give us a bit of a history of environmental justice at CARB? I know that, the Office of Community Air Protection is very important now. So if you could talk about that, and then maybe also talk about, how can researchers like Clare and like Kyaw help with the state's environmental justice efforts?
Sure, and, Clare just said the air quality management districts. Those local districts have primary jurisdiction over stationary sources like refineries, power plants, cement plants, steel industry, and even your neighborhood dry cleaner, which emits toxics. So sources can be huge like a refinery, or they can be very, very small like a dry cleaner and still have an impact on human health. And what has happened over the last 50, 60 years is we've seen communities that have been forced or zoned near these harmful sources, going to those local air districts, asking for some relief, asking for better regulations, better understanding, and better action to reduce that harmful exposure. And it was in 2006 when AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act, was passed by the legislature and signed into law that the state got the ability to regulate stationary sources alongside with mobile sources. But we still only regulate stationary sources for greenhouse gases. We still cannot regulate for criteria pollutants or toxics that are still under the jurisdiction of local air pollution districts. But because we have full jurisdiction of all sources through AB 32, a lot of the historical concerns by local communities around environmental justice and those disproportionate burdens have now worked their way into the conversations on climate change. Specifically, how do you structure greenhouse gas regulations, rules and policies and incentives to also get co-benefits and relief for those other air pollutions of harm that communities have felt have gone unanswered and unaddressed for decades and decades at that local level. The challenge that is sat here in front of ARB and even elected officials and governors is we're talking about climate change, which is greenhouse gases, global pollutants. They don't have a localized harmful impact. A reduction of greenhouse gases anywhere is a benefit everywhere, unlike criterion toxics, which are very, very local. And so ARB has been pushing zero-emission vehicle regulations with support and incentives that are addressed through budgeting with the legislature and governor's office. And now we have end dates for the sale of combustion vehicles across all fleet sizes in California. We are also looking at how to make sure that we reduce emissions from stationary sources. And one of our key programs there is our carbon emissions trading program, the Cap and Trade program. It's one of the programs that is in my portfolio. It's been around for 12 years. We auction permits. So every year the number of permits gets lower and lower. That's the cap. And we auction some of those permits to industry that's covered by that program. That money comes back to the state and is appropriated into priorities that the legislature and the governor agree to as part of the budgeting process every year. One of the big programs that has been funded and is supported through legislation is making sure at least 50% of that revenue from the Cap and Trade program is used to benefit communities that are disproportionately impacted as identified by CalEnviro screen. And so that 50% was a marker set in legislation. We now know the state is investing over 70% of that money that is coming in into programs like the Community Air Protection Program, into community CBOs, community organizations at the table to talk about what's important in their region and actually hearing directly from community advocates, having meetings in those local regions to hear and be in those communities and doing tours to understand what is going on specifically at that local level. So this state, by virtue of its climate policy, has been put in this very new place of having to think about how do our overall policies, how do the state spending decisions and the budgeting process of the legislature and the governor every year, how do those make sure benefits are flowing back into communities across the state? And a lot of that is being focused on those disadvantaged communities. Now, we're starting to see some benefits. This has been going on for about 12 years. We've seen emissions or air pollution improving in these communities. It's not happening fast enough. But because these communities are located near these sources, the more that we push for zero-emission technologies and clean fuels in these communities, the bigger the benefits will be in these communities because they're the ones where those sources are located. So here in Davis, we don't have a power plant. That's huge. We don't have a cement plant. Our air pollution is going to get cleaner, but it's going to get cleaner a lot faster and a lot more in some of these communities where Clare is doing some of her work with her grad students. I think one of the challenges that we faced, and I want to share this because it was surprising to hear this, is when we went into a meeting with some environmental justice advocates and said, look, our data is showing that we're seeing benefits of all of the attention, the bills, and the money and the programs that are being put in the communities. We're seeing improvements in air quality. And somebody actually said, you're painting too rosy of a picture. For us as regulators and for the people who are deciding where to put those limited funds back into California, back into priorities for the state, it's exactly what you want to see, a benefit because of the work that you're doing, of the resources that you're putting towards addressing this issue. But the flip side is that sometimes there is this disbelief that it's actually helping. And that's where how you communicate the science and the data becomes really important. I know, looking across the table, I've been in these classes, that you can read research studies and papers that are 50, 60, 120 pages long. But what people really need to understand is probably something that fits on one page, one piece of paper, front and back, with some easy-to-read graphics, with some non-jargony terms about what it means for the air that they breathe and what it means for the things that they're going to feel. And so that communication piece is now emerging as a really big thing when we think about environmental justice.
Thank you. Turning back to Clare. Clare, where do you see environmental justice work going related to air? And how can the state help and how can local air districts help?
Yeah, these are great questions and great points. I think, where is it going? I don't know. I think there are like improvements, and I think, kind of what you're saying is that it's been such a historical problem, and there's so many intersecting environmental injustices in these communities that even when there's benefit, it's like not fast enough, right? Like sometimes it feels like too little, too late. And I think that part of our job as researchers is to work with these communities hand in hand to identify their problems, to try to answer their questions and try to solve them. But also acknowledging that they've been living with some of the worst poor air quality, right? They've been hosting these sites on behalf of the rest of society. And so, what can we do to try to remedy or rectify those injustices? I think that because of the policy gains, I see the environmental justice movement strengthening, particularly around air quality. I think more communities are able to come to the table as they learn from other communities about what works, what doesn't work, how to partner with folks. And I think a lot of the policy and regulator folks, at least that we work with, are really trying to work with communities to improve their circumstances and to reduce inequality, and that happens on a really slow timescale. And so, what can we do in the short term while keeping an eye on the long term? So I think, the movement is strengthening. I think it is growing in different places, which is really exciting. And I think that communities are learning from everything that we're talking about, right? They're learning through our AES projects, they're learning through working with policy and regulators to really try to protect themselves, to have community uplift, reduce the environmental justice, and open up other forms of social and environmental opportunity. So I think that's really exciting. I think this is also coming up against climate change, right? Where you started, where we're gonna lose 50 years. And I think the communities I work with, are keenly aware of the intersections of environmental injustice and climate vulnerability, which tend to go hand in hand, right? These communities that are frontline and fence line are also frontline and fence line when it comes to climate. And so thinking about how can we ameliorate and rectify both historical and contemporary injustices, as well as looking to the future ones that are coming down the line, and what are some ways that we can insulate and protect these communities. And doing so by partnering, universities have a role to play, as we've illustrated, as well as partnering with regulators, policymakers across scales, and with communities across the state.
Yeah, thank you. Just a heads up to the audience. So we're going to talk for another 5 minutes, and then we're going to open up to questions from you. So spend a couple minutes thinking about something you'd like to hear about. In the meantime, I'd like to stick on the topic of climate change. Chi, you've done a lot of work looking at wildfire emissions, which of course are exacerbated because of climate change. Can you talk about how you see things have changed in the state, specifically related to wildfires?
Sure. I think it's already pretty obviously that based on the data, measurement data, that the wildfire severity and the frequency have been increased, and that has a lot to do with the climate change, because the warming of the warming leads to the change of the precipitation, increase of the temperature. All can cause, increase the frequency and also intensity of the wildfires. And there's also on top of that, so in addition to the amount of being emitted because of the more fire frequency, there's also the question about the chemistry that happened to those emissions, because the amount of the smoke. If you look at the chemical composition of the smoke, it changes when they stay in the air and also get transported from the fire location and to the downwind areas. And then along that process, they also pick up the emissions from regional or locally, such as the urban emissions or some industrial emissions. And that can change the chemistry in a very complex way. And that can cause change not just in terms of the amount of particulate matters due to the fire, that's we call it secondary species, and can also change the toxicity or the ability to interact with light or just affecting the climate differently. So those are kind of part of this overall questions of understanding the wildfire impacts on climate, and how really that's, because there's also a feedback loop. This influence of the smoke on the climate can also affecting eventually the wildfire emissions. So that's actually the part of this part. That part needs a research to. Research studies, like our AES projects to address. And that's involved both field observations and lab studies, and also modeling efforts. Need to be a concerted, multifaceted efforts.
Thank you. And then I want to try to end on a note of hopefulness. So Sahota, related to your work in terms of greenhouse gas fluxes and fluxes of other gases, can you talk about the possibilities for using natural and managed lands to try to sequester carbon in California, and where do we stand with that?
I can't answer the last question about where we stand on that. I can answer some of the questions about this carbon sequestration that happens with older forest, older chaparral, things like that. It's generally considered that when you become old, I'm getting old myself, and I understand this from my own personal viewpoint, that you start not being quite as rigorous at taking down carbon and maybe become neutral. That is, you're not releasing carbon on the average, but you're not taking in carbon anymore. When you get to several hundred years old, for forests, they live a lot longer than we do, the ecosystems. As climate change has occurred, there's a possibility that some of these older growth forests, for example, start becoming sources. The tundra and the Arctic, with some colleagues I work with at San Diego State, have shown some of these concepts, that you switch from being a sink to being a source and releasing carbon in addition to things like methane that sometimes get increasingly emitted when this happens. So this climate change issue of increasing temperature can sometimes have that. It's very complex in the Central Valley in agriculture, though, because we also start fertilizing with extra carbon that the plants want to photosynthesize, while at the same time exposing them to increased temperature stresses that may take their temperature regimes above the optimum photosynthetic levels. So this complexity of trade-offs between a little bit of possible fertilization to this other issue of going beyond your optimum photosynthesis, and then you have the additional stuff that we have lots of insects around, right? And we have lots of other pathogens. And these pathogens have their own responses to climate change, temperature, water regimes, increasing drought or floods. So that complexity can only be done with lots of measurements and then feeding it into models, because the models will run away with you. If you just model, they'll just run away with you for looking at climate change. So instead of just letting it run away, you have to sit there and ground it with measurements, with ground truth measurement type concepts. It's definitely a very complicated question of how to figure out how climate change interacts with these carbon budgets, methane, air quality. As I mentioned, this unexpected study that my colleague's team was looking at showed that this irrigation that we need has this other unintended effect on a whole regional basis. It's a very complicated system when you have climate change thrown into this already complex system.
Thank you. So I'd like to now welcome Ermias and Yufang up to the stage, and then we're going to open the floor to questions. I believe we've got 2 microphones. Okay, so I'm happy to stand. Yeah, so I thought we did have enough chairs. So how about we bring them up? Yeah, okay, come on up. Don't be afraid.
My question is for Clare and Rajinder. So I know that the Office of Community Air Protection was developing a technology clearinghouse to give particularly disadvantaged communities or experiencing environmental injustice kind of ways to approach the problem of point sources like, that cement plant or that power plant with alternatives. For example, you could put this in the smokestack to clear part of the emissions, for example, of NOx. I'm wondering what the status of that is now and how that plays into kind of the addressing of environmental injustices and where you see that going.
So you're correct that the Air Resources Board is developing that clearinghouse, and it's a technology assessment. And so I know that across the divisions at ARB, they're doing an assessment of what types of technologies are available, what are emerging, and what are being researched to put into that database and make it publicly available so that everybody knows. The challenge on point sources, again, is that it's local air districts, and local air districts get to decide on best available technology, barked and backed requirements for those point sources. And different regions of the state have different sources and different topographies and different challenges. For example, the 2 non-attainment areas in the state are the Central Valley and South Coast. And so the local air districts get to decide which technologies they believe are barked or backed under their permitting authorities and should be mandated in those point sources. Now, having those technology assessments means that the public is armed with information so they can advocate for certain technologies, but ultimately it's the local air districts that get to decide what is mandated and must be used. But what is emerging is actions such as community benefit plans. So if you're going to repurpose an old refinery and use it to produce sustainable aviation fuel, or you're going to do a major project in one of these regions, and you're using some federal grant money, and we're looking at it for the state funds as well, is that the operator do a community benefit plan with community input to figure out how they can, one, be as responsive as possible to those air pollution concerns, and what can be mitigation that's meaningful to the community that might be adjacent to that source.
And I can speak specific, that's great. And I can speak specifically to our instrument. It's not regulatory grade. It was funded in part by ARB for the development, but it's a low cost, real time instrument. And so the idea is that we can work with communities to measure, what are the hazardous air pollutants that they're experiencing, and then source identification. So are there sources nearby, right? Because it's complex and it changes depending on which community you're in, so that then we could partner with the air quality management districts and say, hey, look, this is what we found. Let's come up with a plan for what we can do about this. And so it's kind of, it's all complementary to the clearinghouse and kind of the statewide and localized air management district kind of policy regulatory framework, but it's something that we can do as researchers to partner with communities to help kind of assess what they're experiencing, identify, and then work on solutions. Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a great question.
Question there?
Good morning. My name is Esmeralda, and I want to preface my comment by saying that it's coming from a point of collaboration, not criticism. Okay. So you mentioned SB 1383. I work with farmers and farm workers all over the state and in 13 states in the West, where we're trying to assess and address farm stress. When regulations like this pass, they can often be a very big stressor for farmers. Farmers are completing suicide because it is so stressful to deal with some of these changes. It's getting harder to farm. Some of those are not documented because if a farmer is listed as dying by suicide, their insurance will be voided, right? So they cannot protect their family. So some of these things are happening. How do we address that, or how does regulation also support community-based organizations and even programs within the university that are trying to work on this, that are trying to build community resilience and that are trying to incorporate into the conversation of sustainability the farmer, the farm worker, their health? Because if we do not have them, we do not have food, right? If they're not healthy, the production is lower. At the end of the day, agriculture is a business. They need to be healthy in order to produce. That's how we can convince some of these big companies to invest in the health of the farmers and farm workers. And on the topic of researchers and graduate students going out into the communities, how do we ensure that the communities out there end up with the bigger benefit rather than the graduate students and the professors? Because we know that the professors are going to publish, that the graduate students are going to receive their PhDs, they're gonna get awards on their dissertations because they're working with agricultural communities. No, it's the sexy thing to do. It sells, it looks good. But when they walk away from those communities, what do we do? What are they left with? How do we ensure that they're left with more than what is taken away from them?
I can start, and I'm hoping somebody else up here can jump in. So that's an important perspective about the farmers, and there's a couple of points I want to make on this. One, we at the state don't have the personnel or the reach to get into all levels of all of the areas of the state and all of the different people that contribute to the food, the well-being, the economic drivers of the state of California, the innovation that needs to happen. And so we do rely on our outreach through universities, through community colleges, because of that localized presence, to be a mechanism to bring feedback to the state level agencies. And so that's one place where I think advocacy like yours, we have heard directly back through those mechanisms. The other is on agriculture itself. We haven't taken strict regulations for climate change on agriculture. Right now, what our legislation tells us to do is to look at incentive programs. We know that there are ranges of farms out there. It can be a family that is a minority-held farm, that's a very small scale, all the way up to a large industrial farm. All of those exist in the state of California. And there are approaches that we take, and you'll hear from Secretary Ross, which are really focused on incentives to get people to trust that we're trying to help, to trust that we're trying to not undermine crop yields or undermine profits, but really trying to get people to try new things, to test those out, to see how those work. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be other stressors like global prices and competition from other countries for those goods. All of that will still exist. But within the work that we do at the state with our agencies, we try and use that incentive approach because we want people to see us not as the terrible regulator that's going to come in and mandate all these big changes that could hurt the ability to put food on the table for that family or for other people in the state. What we want to do is get people to test out different ways to produce things in a more sustainable way that actually allows them to continue to thrive in California. And to that point, our legislation specifically mandates that as we do rules and regulations at ARB, that we make sure that we are not putting our farmers or our industry at a competitive disadvantage relative to other states or other countries.
Thank you. In terms of the second part of your question, I know this afternoon there's a panel session on healthy lands and communities, I think, and they're probably better suited to answer your question than we or AIR people are. You have time for another question or two?
Can I add something real quick, Cort? This is something that we understand well in this university. There's partnerships among various groups. The Feminist Research Institute, for example, has been very heavily involved in the concepts of indigenous science. It's part of feminist science to also have indigenous science concepts. And in the indigenous science concepts, such as in that book, Fresh Banana Leaves, that very concept you were mentioning is something that is very difficult to overcome. This concept that the academia goes in, extracts the knowledge similar to how colonial systems were extracting resources and still do extract resources from indigenous lands. And this is very much like that there's extraction of knowledge, sometimes some elders who have thousands of years of knowledge base, and then the person goes out, the professors go out, and the grad students go out, and then sort of exploit that as part of this extractive system. So defeating that or working with that and minimizing that is difficult. There has to be a way to bring in the community, the youth, especially in the community, to educate them, give them opportunities to come to the UC system to do research, for example, and further this for their communities so that they can see the benefits. But I think far too often that isn't looked at as carefully and not funded as well as it should. But it's clearly part of this thing that we are aware of, many of us are aware of, but it's difficult to deal with.
Sure.
Very quickly, I just want to mention this is I'm coming from saying, doing measurements point of view. I think what's really important is in terms of the partnership is also for us to share knowledge. So when we bring over the instrument, we usually involve the local community, either high school students or some people who are interested in the science to get involved in the measurements. And so that's a sharing of knowledge and also in terms of interpretation of the data. So I think that will be the contribution I think will be beneficial to the local community in terms of we do research with them.
Other questions? Can we get a microphone?
Yeah, actually, I've got one to start with, if that's all right.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have time for two short questions.
Okay. So wonderful panel, and it already shows the brilliance of having the ag, environmental, and social sciences together in one place and agencies. So I was really interested, Rajinder, in your point about the community partners saying that you were painting too rosy a picture. And I've heard some similar, Jonathan London, I conduct research on environmental justice, including AB 617. And I've heard some similar things from communities over the years of different perceptions of what's going on in their communities versus what the kind of agency representations are. So I'm wondering about how the range of different kinds of research that's happening could help bridge that and help connect community perceptions and scientific perceptions and agency regulator perceptions, since there really are often these kinds of divisions, and I wonder how these could be brought together.
So I think the biggest thing here is trust. And as researchers go out into the community and as we as agency staff go out into the communities, it's not just about going in and having that extractive kind of relationship that Chada was talking about. It's about following up, going back and building that relationship and making sure people know who they can pick up the phone and call if they have a question. And so this means having a kickoff community meeting and inviting people to the local high school or elementary school to learn about what you're doing, what you're trying to do, walking through the data and the analysis in a very understandable way, like you're talking to your neighbor or your grandparent. And then just making sure that as you continue to do the work, they understand what you're trying to do there. And to the extent that you can actually invest in the community itself through like an apprenticeship or a student internship, to have somebody in the community actually be part of the project or part of the effort that's underway, that goes a long way to building that trust. And that's sometimes all it takes is just that one, let me make an offer to help invest in you, in your community, and it's somebody from the community that then is seen as a trusted person to convey that message along with you and any data that you bring back.
Thank you. Yes, and a final question.
Thank you. Fernando Serratos on behalf of State Senator Bill Dodd. Really appreciate the panel and conversation. This is kind of open to everyone. We've talked a lot about measurements and injustice and methane and wildfire issues and things of that nature. Do you have any suggestion on how policymakers who serve constituents can break down this complex information and provide it to the constituents, because we know that they're problems, right? How can a single mom who's dealing with her issues and her kids, or a father of a nuclear family who's trying to, make a living for his family, send his kids to college, things of that nature, combat the day-to-day problems that they face, because we all face problems, and trying to understand the complexities and the necessity to combat methane, to combat social air pollution injustice, to combat all these issues. Everyone in this room understands that these are big problems. That's why we're here learning and talking about the forum. And the people on the panel dedicate their lives to these important issues. So how can we really make this information more readily accessible and be able to provide it to the average Californian so they're able to understand as well what their government is doing, what researchers are doing, and how they can be involved in this process? I know it's kind of a lot, but yeah, go ahead.
That's a great question and an excellent summation of our panel discussion. I have a few ideas, and I think some of them are leveraging those local community-based organizations, right? They are trusted members of these communities who are acutely and highly and very educated on these pressing issues of concern. So that communication can go two ways, right? That can be the CBOs coming and saying, here are our problems, here are our concerns, here are our solutions. But you can also work with them to talk about the things that the state is doing on behalf of the constituents, because we're all in this together. And the state is doing a lot. Maybe it's not doing enough, but it is doing a lot at a range of scales, and that's very complicated. And so communicating that is super, super important, right? Particularly as we go into maybe a more constricted budgetary environment, right? As climate change impacts accelerate, that's going to be huge. So that's one thing. We've heard a lot from communities about maps, right? How many mapping tools are out there? There are a lot of them, but just, a mobile-friendly website engagement where you can just find easily accessible information. This is something that, we're working on a variety of projects that is, again, in a way that's accessible, right? So that can be language access, that can be in terms of distilling these, very complicated scientific concepts into something that's relevant to people in their everyday lives. What does the chemical composition of air quality have to do with me today? Well, that has to do with what you're breathing, right? And what's the information that I need to know if it's breathing? Is it hot? Are there winds? Are there fires, right? The next thing I need to know is action. What action can I take to protect myself and my family from poor air quality? And we can do that, right? We can make an app, we can make a website that can do all of that stuff. In terms of the science and the software, it's not that complicated. I think the communication becomes kind of the central piece, right? The hardest part is to how to get this into people's hands in their daily lives. We did a mini documentary on a project I did in the Central Valley. It was 15 minutes. My students love it, right? So thinking about different forms of media, right? Podcasts, little documentaries, little videos, these sorts of things for taking these big concepts. And you already have regulators and researchers who are experts in these fields and excellent science communicators who can help you build that content and help you deliver it. So those are just a few ideas. I have more. We can talk at coffee if you want.
Thank you very much. I'm going to cut it there because we're over. So thank you to all our lightning speakers and our panelists. We're going to take about a 10-minute break and we'll reassemble at 11 o'clock. Thank you very much.